Hi, and welcome to a special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Jerry Roberts. It is Tuesday, June 14th, Flag Day, and I'm very pleased and honored to welcome back Barney Melekian, a PhD, one of the nation's leading experts on community policing, and interim, soon-to-be former chief of the Santa Barbara Police Department. Chief, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us this morning.
My privilege, Jerry. Thank you.
Just a real quick bit of background on you for those who may be unfamiliar with your career. You served with the Santa Monica Police Department for over 20 years, where you were awarded the Medal of Valor and Medal of Courage, and served as Chief of Police for the city of Pasadena for 13 years. During the Obama administration, appointed and served as Director of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services in the U.S. Department of Justice. In Santa Barbara County, you served as the undersheriff as well as assistant county executive officer. Chief Melekian is an Army veteran. He also served in the Coast Guard Reserves for 23 years and saw 2 tours of active duty, including one in Operation Desert Storm. And since March of 2021, with the departure of former City Police Chief Lori Lunow, he has served as interim chief of the SBPD, and also has been closely involved in the effort to install a citizen oversight process, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But first things first, you said at the meeting on the citizen review thing that you would push your July 1 retirement date if necessary. Is that going to happen, or what's your understanding?
I will probably push it a little bit. We're waiting to see in the process, the selection process for the permanent police chief is well underway, and my hope is that the city administrator's office has identified a candidate and a kind of a start date, and then I'll build my response on that. But I will be saying beyond July 1st, but just how much I don't quite know yet.
All right, and what's next? What are you planning on doing?
Well, I promised my wife that I would at least 2 months I would do nothing and see what that feels like. It occurred to me that I had been working since I was 14 years old, so I know that I will be involved in law enforcement and teaching and the things that I love to do, but I don't know exactly what that looks like yet.
Yeah. What are you going to miss about it?
You know, I will miss 2 things. I think one is the people. Everybody always says that, but it's true. I love the men and women who do police work, who do the real. I've been saying for quite some time that as a police chief or as an undersheriff, I don't do any real work. Real work is done by these 25-year-olds that drive radio cars and dispatch calls and those things. I'll miss that. And I'll miss the one thing I love about, I think, policing more than anything else is you have an opportunity to make a difference in the life of everybody you come in contact with. And it's, it can be positive or negative, but you're going to make a difference. And I will miss that. I will not miss the 3 a.m. phone calls, and I will not miss trying to solve problems that in many cases don't appear to have a very readily apparent solution.
But get pushed onto the police department nonetheless, i.e. homelessness, for example.
All right, that's exactly what came to mind when I said that. Because we were trying to solve that problem for 40 years at least.
Yeah. Let me double back on the new police chief. The last, I was aware it had been narrowed down to 3. Did I understand you to say there is now one candidate who's apparently in talk?
I'm not sure where that is. I think that's where they are. They being city HR and the city administrator's office, but I'm probably would be inappropriate for me to comment on that.
Did you sit in on those 3 interviews?
I did.
Were you able to ask questions?
Yes, absolutely.
I
have to say, I was very impressed with all 3 of them. The city is going to be, whatever Rebecca's final decision is, or the council's final decision, the city is going to be well
What questions did you ask? Were they Santa Barbara specific or?
I tried to make my questions very Santa Barbara specific, and obviously one of the questions was, how do you deal with the issue of staffing challenges? How do you deal with recruitment and retention, which is a huge problem for all of us in this business, not just Santa Barbara. How do you deal? What's your experience in terms of dealing with a commuter police department? You heard me say at the budget hearing that a really high percentage of our people drive a significant distance to get here. So how do you make it? How do you answer the question, why do I want to drive there? I just lost a 10-year detective, a very excellent person who lives in Ventura, who has 2 young children. Her husband works for another agency in LA County, and she had a chance to go to work for an agency in Ventura. And it's a little hard. I asked her at the exit interview, I said, what can I say to get you to stay or to change your mind? And she said, can you give me 3 hours a day of my life back? And I can't answer that, I can't. So that's a challenge. And then obviously experience in dealing with homeless and mentally ill. And I think being present, it's a huge issue here. But to be present both for the community, but also for the men and women of the department in terms of their daily activities. So that's kind of where I focused my.
Well, talk a little bit more about what does that mean, being present? What do you mean?
Well, it's very easy, I think, for police executives to get sort of wrapped up in the work that they do. And I'm not just trying to be glib when I say that I don't do the real work of policing. The real work, that's not just a little catchphrase. But you have to get out of this office. The chief has to get out of this office and go down to briefings, go out to the parking lot where the officers are in a radio guard, go to the range qualifications. They have to do these things. And modern day chiefs are very well aware that they have to do those things with the community. They have to go to community meetings, they have to go to neighborhood watch and all that. But all too often, in my experience, they forget that the men and women who are doing this work are the ambassadors of the department. And I used to say, I tell officers that I could go give speeches all I want about the importance of constitutional policing and about caring for people and all that stuff. But the truth or falsity of what I say is going to be determined by some 23-year-old officer at 2 o'clock in the morning in an alley when no one's looking. That's the reality of it. And I feel that it's imperative that you have a connection with them.
When you started out in policing back in before the last ice age, which is when I started out in journalism, 1978. I imagine that things were a little bit different in the way that departments were set up. It was more hierarchical. Say a word, if you will, about the kinds of changes you've seen.
Sometimes I get asked that question a lot, and it's actually 1973. So I'm 49 years and 4 months almost into this work. But I sometimes feel like somebody opened up a time capsule and plucked me out of it and said, "Here, tell us about how it was, back in the day." But I do remember walking into my first roll call in the Santa Monica Police Department in 1973, and it was 90% veterans. It was 95% white males, and it was I was the smallest guy in the room. That's how the business has changed, and it was very hierarchical. And everything that I just said about the chief needs to be present and touch bases and all that absolutely never happened. You never saw the chief of police. Heck, I never saw my lieutenant most of the time. The lieutenant sat in this office, and the only thing that you wanted from that lieutenant was for him not to want to talk to you, as long as he wasn't.
News is good news.
Yeah, as long as he wasn't talking to you, it was okay. and the community. I remember going to a community meeting, and the people were complaining about quality of life in neighborhoods and people racing cars and kids hanging out. And I remember watching this sergeant pull out a flip chart and look at the number of radio calls and where things were, and basically say, well, you don't have a problem. And that was the whole mentality, was that we're the professionals and we will tell you how you want to be policed. And I've probably gone through, if you count the summer of 2020, which I do as a profound sort of evolutionary piece, I think this is really the third evolution I've gone through personally. And I came in on the end of the sort of a fourth one, which was the Miranda wave. Because when I came in this business, Miranda had only been implemented a few years prior. And it was people said it was going to ruin policing. It was going to
the requirement that you
read somebody their rights. I mean, that was never done. So that the changes have been profound. You know,
what are the other waves?
I think the first one for me was community policing. The switch from the professional model in about the mid 80s, after the publication of Broken Windows and a recognition that the community needed to be engaged, that community policing, which was basically build relationships with the community and solve problems. That was a huge wave, a huge change. I still remember, you know, you go back to 1973 when I was a brand new officer, Sergeant Dick Tapia, who's since passed away, would end every roll call by saying, "Now remember, boys," because that's all it was. He said, "Now remember, boys, you're not going out there to sell ice cream." Well, about 1983 or 84, you know, and I'm a brand new sergeant, and now Dick Tapia is still there, and he's now talking about going to this community meeting and meet with this person on a traffic issue and this other thing. And when the officers left, I said, "Gee, Dick, I remember when you told us we weren't going out there to sell ice cream." He didn't skip a beat. He said, "Son, now we're giving it away." But that was a huge, profound change. And then the next one, in my opinion, was 9/11, because 9/11 and the whole emphasis on fighting terrorism and policing as an information source for the federal government. I was very much involved in a series of meetings around that, about how to implement appropriate homeland security pieces. Really changed policing in a lot of ways. Some of the concerns people have about the militarization of the police and about the detachment of the police and all that really came out of the post 9/11 era. And then obviously 2020, we're in another one, the social justice wave.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I know you do consulting work with various departments, not only around the country, around the world. And I imagine if I understood you, you'll probably be doing more of that. But as you prepare to depart, can you just give us your, frank assessment of our police department, kind of similarities and differences with others of our size, and what stands out?
The problem with what I'm about to say is it's going to sound sort of self-serving because I'm sitting in this office, but I am really, really genuinely stunned by how good the people are that work here. And you've heard me talk about this in other places, but I think that at the top of that list, the reason I say that is this notion of the reverence for life. A lot of the reform efforts, starting with the President's Commission in 2015, said that departments needed to really inculcate a reverence for life. That is, not resorting to lethal force, even if it's legally justified. And from the time I came here, there's easily been 10 incidents that I could strip away all the extraneous stuff, and legally and morally, I got challenged on using the word morally once, but lethal force would be justified. And by morally, I mean, do you as a human being, when it's over, can you live with what happened? Are you satisfied that you did everything that you could to find some other alternative than killing somebody? And this department does it consistently. They will trade time and space for that. The detectives that work here are first rate. When I first came here, and we had 2 homicides before I started. We had another one right after I started. Everybody was in custody, and there wasn't a gang-related retaliatory cycle that exploded out of that. The issue of watching these officers deal with the homeless and with the mentally ill, and the way, and I'm not talking about just what they do in public. I'm talking about the language that they use in private meetings, or when they meet with, with business groups, or when they meet with other people, some of whom are screaming about, do something, and I watch the manner in which these sergeants and lieutenants just, they take that all in, they process it, they do what they can, but they're very clear on the rights of everybody that's involved. And they're very clear that ultimately they're the agents of society and what society wants. And I'm just incredibly impressed with this group. And they haven't gone, I'm involved with this group called Blue Courage, which is a group out of Illinois. And the premise of that is that the corruption of the 21st century in policing is cynicism. And certainly I've gone through that stage in my career. I'm very cynical about, people and about life and about situations. That cynicism does not appear to have seeped into the Santa Barbara Police Department. And I'm very impressed by that.
Say a word, if you would, about the department's relationship with minority communities, because that's, I think, at the heart of a lot of the Community Formation Commission's work.
Yeah, and one thing about doing this for 50 years, I'm not naive about the role of policing and particularly in relationships with minority and disadvantaged communities. And I was the police chief in Pasadena for 13 years. I was the first non-Black police chief in about 12 or 13 years. People don't realize Pasadena is a majority minority city, and it's home to the oldest African-American community in Southern California. And at one time it was nearly 40% African-American. It's not today, but it was. So I'm very, very sensitive to the issues and the role of policing in maintaining the status quo and all those things. But I have to say that and I don't pretend to be a historian about the Santa Barbara Police Department. I do know that there was an African-American community here that was much larger than it is today, much like what happened in Pasadena. The Hispanic community is very large, and now we're dealing with gentrification issues. But I have never gotten the sense, even in the heart of the CFC meetings, where people were talking about being afraid of the police. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the CFC in a bit, but people never talked about being afraid of the Santa Barbara police. They talked about being afraid of the police, sort of writ large. And the stories that would be told about, people whose relatives have been killed by the police was not in Santa Barbara, it was somewhere else. So I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, the relationship with minority community is great here in Santa Barbara. I'm sure that it's not. I'm sure that it could be better, but I haven't seen any indication of brutality or of discriminatory treatment of minorities or any of the uses of force that are disproportionately on one population or another. I haven't seen that, but I do think, I've tried to make some changes while I'm here. Some cultural building. We introduced a 5th week of post-academy training and meetings with the Hispanic community and the African-American community, and trying to acquaint people, especially new officers and especially officers who don't live here, with what the history of the city is and what people who live here has experienced, what the police department is. And I'm hoping that whoever comes after me will build on that.
let me double back on this question, because I mean, this issue, because it's come up a couple of times about recruiting and retention. And as you point out, it's not just a local issue, it's really a national issue. But has that really arisen in a more acute way since the George Floyd killing, or has it ever been thus? Can you kind of put some focus on that? Why we have that problem now?
Well, it's certainly been exacerbated by George Floyd and the social justice movement. And I think one of the things but the recruitment challenge has been going on for a decade. This is the numbers of people who show up to take the initial exam, which varies from place to place. But in 1972, when I showed up at El Camino College in LA to take the initial physical fitness exam and a written exam, there were probably 2,000 people there. I mean, it was, and it was, it was massive. Today, I just got briefed this morning at our most recent local one, 16 people showed up. So that recruitment issue has been going on for a while. But George Floyd and the social justice movement and the willingness, at least initially, to embrace the whole defund the police movement, I think really did an enormous amount of damage, because the things that officers deal with, and it's not the big stuff. I used to say, pardon the crude metaphor, but how much do they pay you to have a drunk throw up on your shoes? I mean, that's the kind of thing that officers deal with. At the end of the day, you don't do it for money. I mean, money's nice and people argue about it and all that, but you do it because there's two things. One, there's a sense of purpose for yourself and self-fulfillment. And the other is a recognition that society values what you do and appreciates it. And I think one of the things that happened in 2020 was a very unified message across the country that, no, we don't appreciate what you do. We don't like what you do, and you're responsible for all of these racial and social inequities that exist in our society. And that's incredibly disillusioning for people. And while, especially here in Santa Barbara, the officers that are leaving are not necessarily leaving the profession. But they are making quality of life decisions, like the detective I referenced earlier, who said, I'm going to keep doing this job because I know how to do it, but I'm not going to commute an hour and a half anymore to do it. I'm going to do it someplace where I'm 15 minutes from my house. And maybe in the long run, that'll be a good thing, because we'll all get back to community policing, because I think we're all going to have to go back to more localized recruiting. But I have believed for a long time that this profession has not done as good a job as it could in advertising what we do. And going back to how I started this thing, the fact that you can make a difference in the life of people that you come in contact with. I think for too long we focused on the drama and the excitement and the crime fighting, and that's really part of it, but it's not all of it.
Yeah, I know what I was doing in 1972. Why did you decide to become a cop in 1972?
That's funny. I got out of the Army in 1970, and I was going to Santa Monica City College, and I was working in a bank, and I realized pretty quickly that I did not want to be in the bank for the next 30 or 40 years, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I watched an episode of Adam 12. And there was, and I remember it to this day, the episode was Elegy for a Pig. And it started out, because if you remember, that's what people were calling the police back then, pigs. And it was about an officer who'd been killed in the line of duty. But the episode really recapped the training and the purpose and the hiring process and all of that. And I thought, I think I might like to do that. And my original plan was to was to get hired as a police officer, do that for 3 or 4 years, and go to law school. That was my sort of how I envisioned this was going to go. I did not count on falling in love with the profession, and I later would have an opportunity to go to law school and didn't. But that was why. And I said, I think I want to do that. And I was not probably, like I said, I was the smallest guy in the room when I walked in Santa Monica. I was probably not what the profession exactly envisioned, but they took a chance on me. So.
But culturally, what was there this feeling that, you know, police officers were respected, that you talked about how that's kind of gone away?
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant. You know, there were people who were calling the police pigs back then, but you didn't have a sense that the average person, and certainly the business community and the political leadership and all of that, you didn't have a sense that they felt that way. That group was kind of in the minority. I do think, quite frankly, that especially in the 1970s, before community policing, I think community policing arose out of the fact that the professional model that we were engaged in, which when I was in the academy, you were taught very specifically that building relationships with people was bad. The whole emphasis on everything was about anti-corruption. You did not, and so the professional model said that you kept everyone at arm's length, and you know, the whole Jack Webb, just the facts. You know, I don't care. I'm not here to care. I'm here to enforce the law and to do what I need to do. And the truth is that didn't work, and it especially didn't work in minority communities. And people started to realize that, and that's what community policing grew out of.
How many officers are we down? Just to return to that for a second.
We're authorized 142. I think we're down 18 right now, not counting people who are injured on duty and not counting the fact that we have shortages in dispatch. And so we have 5 or 6 officers who are not on the street who are working in dispatch to fill those vacancies. So functionally, we're probably down, pushing close to 30%.
And as a practical matter, what does that mean?
It means that a lot of our specialty units, the anti-crime teams, the homeless, they're called the street crimes unit, but probably my successor will rename that because they're not doing that anymore. They're really dealing with the homeless. They're the bike team. They're supposed to be a sergeant and 7 officers. They're a sergeant and 3. They're supposed to be 7 or 8 motor enforcement officers. There's 3. The special enforcement team has been rolled back into patrol. Detectives are supposed to are down about 8 positions. So functionally, the emphasis has to be on patrol, followed very closely by investigative follow-up, and everything else is sort of secondary.
So that'll be the most important issue facing the new chief?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. You know, nationally, and I think even to an extent here in Santa Barbara, you know, there's really a perception there's been a big spike in crime, and you know, we hear, I don't know, progressive prosecutors and others saying, oh, no, look at these statistics. That's not the case. And, you know, my experience in politics with that is once you're citing statistics, you're usually in trouble. But can you sort of define, you know, what is there a spike in crime? How serious is it? What is it? You know, what can you compare it to?
I think it's hard to compare Santa Barbara to some of the areas that are making the national news, because the areas where you're seeing really massive surges in violent crime is in large metropolitan areas. LA, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York. Here, our violent crime is actually at or below, you know, sort of where it's been historically. Property crime is up slightly, but not dramatically. But the person crime, the violent crime, is not really spiked at all. and I really can't attribute to anything other than, to some extent, probably geographic isolation, and the fact that we have been emphasizing for the past year this need to be, the term I use is felt presence, that the officers are out there, that they're around, and not, excuse me, not so much in a kind of an oppressive old school way, but just in a enough of a presence for people to be aware that they're there.
And what do you say to people that say, yeah, property crime is up and, we feel less safe, and, it's because of Proposition 47 and all that's followed from that, and because we let everybody out of the jails during the pandemic?
Well, we're not, I mean, if you talk to the police chiefs in Lompoc and Santa Maria, they would probably have a very different take on what I'm saying, because they have seen spikes in shootings and spikes in violent crime. We just haven't seen it here. I think the frustration that I have, both sort of professionally and personally, about any reform efforts, and one of my projects in the county, in the executive office, excuse me, was to be involved in sort of a criminal justice mapping project to divert people out of the criminal justice system, and therefore out of jail. And I think there's a lot of, I think during COVID, it was demonstrated that a significant number of people could be, released pre-trial without consequence and would show up and all those things. But my frustration is always that we always seem to paint these things in these kind of all or nothing ways. Do I think that the numbers that were artificially low, for example, during COVID, is that a realistic target? No, it's not, because there were hundreds of people who were cited for offenses instead of booked, many of whom didn't show up. Warrants ultimately were forgiven just in the interest of bureaucracy. There are people who are better served by going to jail and by being exposed to treatment programs and other alternatives. I mean, I think there's ways to do this, but I don't think that necessarily that those things locally in Santa Barbara, they have not led to a spike in crime.
Hey, give us your take on the recall of the district attorney in San Francisco, Chester Boudin. I mean, he's in one sense, he kind of got blamed for everything that happened in terms of crime and even homelessness. Is that a setback for so-called progressive prosecutors? Do you see that?
Well, I kind of hope so. I mean, I'm not a big fan of progressive prosecution. I'm a fan of enlightened prosecution. I mean, I think there's a difference. I think one of the things that changed, and certainly in the last decade, there used to be the sort of the prevailing wisdom among criminal justice reformers was that the police were the gatekeepers to the criminal justice system, and if the police weren't arresting everyone, then you wouldn't have so many people in prison, you wouldn't have mass incarceration. Well, somebody finally woke up to the fact that the police are not the gatekeepers of the criminal justice system. The police just deal with whatever's put in front of them. The gatekeepers are the district attorney's offices. And they're the ones who make the decision about whether these people go through the court process or other things. And again, it goes back to what I said a minute ago. I don't think that Boudin or Gascon in LA or some of the other ones, I don't think they're completely off base, but it's like they've gone into this all or nothing trap. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. There has to be some way for those offices to evaluate the circumstances that they're permitted or presented with, and make decisions about the individual about whether they're going to go through the process or not. But what they do is especially, and I get it, I mean, these are large areas, they make, and I think, for example, Joyce Dudley here does a great job of making a distinction between just creating this matrix that says, well, if you did X, Y, and Z, well, you're going to get prosecuted, and if all three boxes are checked, you're not going to get prosecuted. As opposed to saying, what is Barney Melekian doing? Why did he do this? Tracy McCouga and the Public Defender's Office has got this holistic defense thing, and I think the only thing missing is that Joyce didn't come up with a catchy phrase like that too, because she could have called it holistic prosecution, and that's what she's doing, and looked at the whole person and say, how do we solve this societal problem? And I know I'm getting a little esoteric here, but I think that the problem with the so-called progressive prosecutors is they came in with this one-size-fits-all approach to this, and it was wrong.
Yeah, somebody referred to it as a policy based in ideology that worked everywhere except reality.
There's some truth to that. Yeah.
And so you're saying it's much more of a case-by-case situation, that you can't come in with these sort of sweeping policy changes. We're not going to prosecute anybody, any kid.
Some people, including some juveniles, are evil. That's not a word that anybody likes anymore, but it's true. What's equally true is that many people who commit crimes, that's in quotation mark, are, a product of a social or economic background that probably deserves some consideration, or deserves a second chance, or deserves, especially kids, deserve some diversion sort of out of the system. But it ought not to be everybody, because not everybody fits that.
Speaking of people that are evil, we saw this horrible mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas, a week or two ago. Before that, in the grocery store in Buffalo, and really there were, it seemed to me, sort of two different tactics that law enforcement took there. I mean, one, you did have a security guard who ended up getting shot and killed in Buffalo, who tried to intervene at the front end. And then you had sort of the opposite in Uvalde, with all these cops standing outside the hall of the classroom. I mean, what's your take on all that?
Well, I suppose the conventional thing to do is, well, we should wait till all the facts unfold. But actually, I think the facts have unfolded. 19 children died in that classroom, along with two teachers. That's the fact. And the fact is that there were people standing around while it happened, and that's the fact. Why they made the decisions that they made, what caused them to want to stop and wait, I don't know. But I do know that ever since Columbine, the training has always been, and certainly as in Santa Barbara, I reiterated it the day after Uvalde when I came to work, is that you gather the first 2 or 3 officers that show up, you form a response team, and you enter and you take action. And you understand that doing so is not the safest course of action. But in point of fact, it's one of those moments that we get paid for. There was a column, I can't remember who it was, I'll have to look it up. It ran in the Wall Street Journal, I believe. But she said, the social contract is that in those kind of situations, when your life is at risk, the social contract is that the officers that show up will risk their lives to save yours. That's that contract. And if the public ever decides that contract is not being honored, or that contract is worthless, we're going to be in serious trouble.
One of the issues, I guess, in that decision was, the fact that maybe some of the officers feeling like they were outgunned. How important is gun safety legislation? How big a deal is it that kids can buy, 18-year-olds can buy an AK? I mean, where do you stand on the whole kind of Second Amendment versus we lock all the guns up?
Well, if I answer this question appropriately, I'll manage to irritate everyone who's watching.
That was my idea in asking.
Because I am a Second Amendment person. I do believe that the Second Amendment was written to guarantee individual gun ownership. And I don't think it was written to allow 18-year-olds to have AR-15s or military-grade assault weapons. I think that's insane. There was a headline in the Onion a few years ago after the tragedy at Sandy Hook, and I was involved in that a little bit because of when I was with DOJ. But the Onion had a headline that said, "There's nothing that can be done to prevent this," says the only country in the world where this happens. I think there is in some of the red flag issues. I do think that what gets, again, this all or nothing thing. It's not gun legislation or mental health. It's not one or the other, but there are politicians on both sides who try to frame it that way. It has to be gun safety, gun legislation, and appropriate mental health resources. Every one of these mass shooters has this, the story is almost all the same. Somehow they got this gun, somehow they had this grievance, and somehow, everybody that had contact with them knew that they were. I think a few years ago, I was interviewed about one of these incidents, and I said, the decision we have to make as a society is, when do we want the state to intervene in the lives of the strange? Because every one of these folks are described as weird, as loners, as isolated, as doing strange things. But we don't have any means to address that. We haven't created anything. It's ridiculous that at 18 years old you can go buy an AR-15. That should go out the window. But these red flag laws have to be strengthened. The gun violence restraining orders that we have in California, I think, are an incredibly valuable place to start. We're probably not certainly not in my lifetime, and probably not our children's lifetime, going to disarm this country. And I'm not even sure that's a good idea. But I do think we could probably start collecting AR-15s at some point, or at least put them in the hands of at least require them to be registered. Because in California, they have to be registered, but not in every state in the union do they have to be registered. They ought to at least have a database for that. If we had a whole nother hour, we could talk about the limitations that have been put on the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Federal law enforcement agency that's tried for years to create a database of weapons, a database of people who are either have felony violations or treated for mental health issues or whatever. It ends up going nowhere. So sorry for the sermon.
No, that's and the Supreme Court apparently is about to throw out restrictions on open carry in New York, so that'll work out real well too, I imagine.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the day when everybody can wear a gun while we walk around. Maybe we can bring the horse back. That would probably. I wonder how that would fit with getting rid of cars.
Well, my wife would like it anyway. All right, you've been so generous with your time, but I do want to ask you about the CFC stuff before we go. So this appointed commission worked for 13 months researching various forms of civilian oversight, came back with recommendations. And on Monday last, the city administrator's office, the deputy, presented a proposal or a framework for an ordinance, and members of the CFC testified that they were opposed to it, and seemed to be somewhat surprised by it. How much of a serious problem is it going forward for this kind of policy to be put in place if the people who were in charge of the research are saying that?
My hope is that when things cool down a little bit about this, that people will look and realize that the oversight recommendations that were made were overwhelmingly adopted. What the city administrator recommended was 20 of the 22 duties and authorities listed under commission and an independent monitor. And there does, I mean, I think I've said from the beginning, my position in this has never changed very much. One is that I believe that oversight is beneficial to both the men and women of the police department as well as the community. I think in this day and age, and particularly because we don't have, Santa Barbara has not had any critical incidents. Santa Barbara's use of force is minimal. Santa Barbara's complaint history is minimal. So we have an opportunity to put something in place that will work. I think you saw a distinction between the two. There are really two main components to what the CFC put forward. One was an oversight board. And I know that the people who spoke thought that, well, the Fire and Police Commission, can't do that. It shouldn't do that. They don't have the gravitas, whatever their rationale was. But in point of fact, that a lot of the authority that CFC wanted to give to this oversight board, the commission has. The city administrator has had discussions about basically revamping the membership of the board, about moving the meeting to City Hall and televising it, probably having more than one meeting a month. So the opportunity to remake this commission, it's really a distinction, in my opinion, a distinction without a difference in terms of creating an oversight board, except you don't have to build a new board. You don't have to work out the distinctions between this oversight board and the Fire and Police Commission. I said from the beginning that I think that this oversight needs to solve three things. It needs to provide people an alternative method of filing complaints about alleged police misconduct. They have to have some way to do it besides go to the police department. Secondly, is that an oversight board has to be able to continually take a look at what the police department does, how it functions, an audit function, if you will, and to have the police chief report on a regular basis in public about issues of interest to that board. And the third thing is, God forbid we have a significant incident like an officer-involved shooting that results in a fatality that's controversial. There has to be a place for the community to be able to go and express their frustration, and for the police department to come and explain what happened. And those, to me, are the three core functions of oversight. I think the one area about whether the Fire and Police Commission does it, I think you heard even a lot of the former commissioners say, if it's going to be that, then make some changes. I think the bigger sticking point for some of them was probably the issue of this independent monitor. And I've been clear, and not everybody agrees with me, that I don't think the work is there for that person, but I may be wrong about that. That may change. And the city administrator's office said, what, let's do this audit. Let's do a strategic audit of the department, so we have kind of a foundation to work from. And let's determine what our audit needs are, and let's in the meantime, the new assistant city administrator, Barbara Anderson, will coordinate all this. And I think, quite frankly, Member Harmon's suggestion about, okay, look, let's bring in an expert, in this area to help Barbara stand this up, and we'll make a decision about where we go. I thought that was perfectly sensible.
All right. But we did hear a lot of strong language, as you know.
We did.
Slap in the face. It's upholding white supremacy. How do you respond specifically to that?
Well, the fact is, and I really want to be very careful about how I word this, but the leadership of the CFC was briefed every step of the way between April 22nd and June 6th about what the city's position was evolving to. So the statement that they were blindsided or they didn't know it was coming or whatever simply isn't so. Maybe they felt that way. Maybe they didn't feel that it was specific enough. I don't know what happened. I do know that there was one member, the former chair of the CFC, was sort of tasked to work with me to sit down and develop stuff. And ultimately, two other former members of the CFC were in some of those meetings. And then the whole process kind of moved over to the city administrator's office and to Barbara Anderson. And that's where it went. I don't know how to explain why they feel so strongly about it. I do think that, I wish, and maybe it's too much to hope for, but I wish we could not sort of inject this notion that this is white supremacy asserting itself, when it really is a matter of government just trying to figure out how to give this group, which was tasked by the city council, to provide recommendations to the council for oversight, and for the majority of those recommendations to be adopted. I understand particularly about the monitor piece, but I don't think we need to go to this place of, well, it's a slap in the face, or it's white supremacy asserting itself, or it's any of that. It's not. It's about governance, and it's about how to do this. So.
All right, fair enough. We'll leave it there. Chief, you really appreciate it, and I guess you'll be leaving sometime. Well, we don't know when that'll be exactly.
It'll be sometime. It'll be before the end of July, and I think it'll be. I'll have a specific date here in the next week or so, I think.
All right.
The planning commission at home gets the final word on this. So.
All right. Any final words about public safety in Santa Barbara that the citizens should hear? Yeah,
I think for all the discussion about staffing, and for all the discussion about whether we have enough people should be aware of two things. One is that the people that we have are incredibly good and talented and committed to what they do. And secondly, that this problem some of the systemic issues, homeless and mental health, for example, which eat up an enormous amount of public safety time, both police and fire. I think the city and the county are really starting to get on the road of working this together and trying to figure out, how do we provide more mental health beds? How do we provide more drug treatment beds? And maybe how do we make this a little bit less voluntary for some of these folks? I think we're moving in the right direction. But I live in this city. I'm going to continue to live in this city when my time here is done. And I think people should be very proud of what they have.
All right. Chief Barney Melekian, thank you so much for speaking with us, and good luck doing nothing.
I'm going to do my best.
My experience is it doesn't work, but you go for it. Anyway, thanks again, Chief.
All right, Jerry. Thank you very much.